Anachronox is sort of the Rodney Dangerfield of Ion Storm's games. I say that in part because it's easily the most overtly comedic of the studio's three main franchises.
The only thing in the way of chaos and the destruction of all we know and see is Sly Boots, master of time and space.
Okay, I made up the last bit. But the rest is true. He also told me his real name and other stuff.
What's his real name?
I can't pronounce it.
But I also make the comparison to Rodney Dangerfield because I don't think the game gets the respect it deserves. Deus Ex was the breakout game, the game that had serious adult topics and toyed with emergent gameplay. Daikatana was the memorable failure, the one everyone likes to point and laugh at. And frankly, Daikatana is nowhere near as bad as its reputation suggests, but that's another video. Anachronox, however, landed somewhere in the forgotten middle. It wasn't a hit, but it generated a dedicated group of followers. It was a game full of heart and quirky characters, but also a game that is a little badly paced and a little awkward to play. It's a game that received so little respect upon release that in order to follow the walkthrough on game FAQs, you need to load 3 separate FAQs because the first person didn't finish the write-up, someone else had to come in behind them to finish it, and then left holes that were then filled by a third person whose instructions are the most complete but also the most vague. And when I ran a totally non-scientific Twitter poll to see how the game had held up in the mind of the gaming public, I found that almost 60% of people have never even heard of it, as if it had just vanished. The game just gets no respect. So I thought I'd do a video maybe to try to set things right with Anachronox a little bit. This isn't really a deep dive into the game's thematics, but more of a look back at the weird, quirky, and largely forgotten little title overshadowed by Deus Ex and Daikatana. And just as people remember Deus Ex and Daikatana, people remember Warren Spector and John Romero as the powerhouse developers leading projects at Ion Storm, but they often forget about Tom Hall, who was a founder of the company. Hall was a veteran game dev who was also a founding member of id Software. He had been at id since the early days, where he, John Carmack, John Romero, and others were working at Softdisk during the day, and moonlighting on their own game at night on Softdisk's machines. That game was, of course, Commander Keen. Hall was the lead designer on Keen, a role that in those days meant story and world design as much as it meant systems and level design, and Keen was a reflection of Hall's sensibilities. It was quirky, goofy, and a little idiosyncratic. More than anything, it was joyful, a kid's adventure fighting aliens and snagging lollipops and Pepsi cans. It was a power fantasy, but it wasn't of the grimdark, sword and sorcery Conan the Barbarian type, or the scary Giger alien space marine type. It was power fantasy by way of Saturday morning cartoon, as saccharine as any of the candies Keen picks up on his adventures. It was id's first big hit, propelling the team to leave their jobs at Softdisk. It also introduced Dopefish, which I guess you could say is maybe something like id's version of 0451? It shows up a lot, is all I'm saying. But as Hall's time at id wore on, it became clear the studio was increasingly interested in marrying Carmack's then unbelievable rendering tech with Romero's attraction to lean, intense, fast-paced mechanics, and Adrian Carmack/Kevin Cloud's fascination with macabre techno-industrialist and gothic horror tones, all with minimal systems, minimal narrative, and minimal adorkable whimsy. This kind of left Hall's creative instincts towards character-driven, humorous worlds out in the cold. By the time Doom was in the middle of development, it was apparent that things weren't working out for him. He had written an extensive Doom Bible detailing the history of the military base and described a cutscene in the opening of the game. This was detailed in David Kushner's book, Masters of Doom. Quote, "The game would begin," Hall wrote, "with the player assigned to a military base conducting experiments on a distant moon. The action would start with the player engaged in a game of cards with some other soldiers. Suddenly a burst of light would flash and demons would come, ripping the player's best friends to shreds. Tom wanted to create an immediate sense of terror as the player watched his pal die a terrible instant death." End quote. And if you've played the final version of Doom, it's clear this work went largely ignored. Doom was a game about abstract, moody spaces players ran through at 1,000,000 miles an hour while unloading armies worth of ammunition. It was pure id. There was no room for story or characters, for humor or for heart. Ultimately, Hall resigned from id Software in 1993, just 3 months before Doom's release. Time passed, with Hall working a few years at Apogee/3D Realms, working on games like Rise of the Triad. And eventually, in 1996, he and John Romero, newly divorced from id Software, decided to open their own game studio, Ion Storm. Thanks to a lucrative deal with publisher Eidos, Ion Storm was, at least at the time, flush with cash. It seemed like all of the project leads would be able to make their own dream game, and in Hall's case it would be a game that drew from his inspirations and influences and reflected his quirks and humor in a way he never really got to do at id or Apogee outside of Keen. The resulting game? Well, it starts with a U. Give up?
Anachronox. Man, you guys are dumb.
But you said it started with a U.
Yeah, I know.
And in a lot of ways, it was Keen writ large, a plucky, spacefaring adventure through an absurd world littered with jokes and starring characters that had far more personality than the Dangerous Daves and Doom guys of the world.
I hate this place.
Hall had been quoted as saying that Chrono Trigger is the primary inspiration for Anachronox as recently as this year and as long ago as an interview with IGN in 2000. And you can see that influence throughout the game. There's the limited party size of 3 characters at a time, the lack of random battles and instead having specific enemies with preset encounters that may even be avoidable, and the fact that the whole party follows you around on the world map all feel like artifacts of Chrono Trigger's influence. Then there's the epic scope of the story contrasted with the fact that it was about strong individual personalities that sort of bring their own little worlds with them. In the case of Democritus, quite literally.
Please tell me this is a joke.
Surprise! We've come to compensate you for all your generous help.
Shoot me.
But if Chrono Trigger is the flashpoint for a lot of Anachronox's design, it isn't quite where the game actually ended up. Anachronox is, at its most basic level, an interesting chimera of RPGs and point-and-click adventure games. You're free to wander the environment in an over-the-shoulder third-person perspective using standard WSD controls, but if you stop moving, the mouse switches to an in-game cursor that you use to interact with various objects, reframing the 3D space as a point-and-click title. This kind of divides gameplay into 2 modes. Moving the story forward sometimes involves traditional JRPG quests that take you into dungeons full of monsters, occasionally culminating in a boss fight. And you engage enemies in turn-based combat that conforms to more or less JRPG staples. Magic, special abilities per character, waiting for meters to fill, Phoenix Down equivalents, that sort of thing. It's all very late 90s Square Enix. For example, here's Final Fantasy VIII. And here's Anachronox. But progress also involves environmental puzzles that would feel more at home in a LucasArts Scum game. There aren't a ton of moon logic puzzles that involve using the paintbrush on the ham sandwich to trick the Duke into spilling his innermost secrets to get the password to the door, or whatever. It's a lot more scaled back. Each character has their own abilities to help the team proceed, whether that's hacking, analytical thinking, or lockpicking. So it's less use lubricant on mannequin torso to scare the cat, or whatever, and more looking for opportunities to, say, have Pal 18 hack into a computer system, or Grumpos annoy someone with an incredibly long yarn. As Tom Hall put it in that interview with IGN in 2000, quote, "I believe it's the first annoyance skill in an RPG," end quote. So the point-and-click sections are a lot of that, and, well, a lot of talking to absolutely everyone and clicking on absolutely everything, as you tend to do in that genre. This isn't entirely a bad thing. As with the LucasArts games the point-and-click sections are modeled after, talking to everyone is where a lot of the game's humor, charm, and world-building comes from. But it also means the game's point-and-click sections are a little directionless, often necessitating talking to every interactable character before finding the one that is relevant, or desperately searching for the one MacGuffin that will move the story forward. It's why even though I played through the game years ago, I felt no shame in reaching for a walkthrough and making this video. This peculiar melding of specific genres gives Anachronox a distinct identity. In some ways it feels like a super primitive Mass Effect, a sci-fi epic RPG where you're hanging out with your friends who all have outsized personalities, where you pick 2 of them at a time to go on adventures with. In other ways, it feels like it kind of came in from another timeline, where Western RPGs and first-person shooters didn't come to dominate our approach to mechanic design, where genres that focused on narrative conveyance and character work were the dominant driving creative forces in the game industry. There really is nothing quite like it, a branch of narrative-based game design that appeared before modern notions of in-game cinematic storytelling had crystallized. It may be something of an evolutionary dead end, but it's a fascinating one. At the same time, though, it's hard to escape the feeling that this particular genre fusion may have doomed Anachronox from finding a wide and accepting audience. In 2001, Western RPGs dominated on the PC, and JRPGs were more of a console thing. That's not a hard and fast rule, mind you, but generally the PC gaming audience expected their RPGs to be expressive, expansive, and freeform in their approach. Fallout, or Baldur's Gate, or even something like EverQuest. Meanwhile, console gaming was the home of JRPGs. Your Chrono Triggers, your Final Fantasy VIIs, your Earthbounds. Comparatively linear titles that focus less on role-playing than storytelling, less on expressive mechanics than inventive turn-based combat systems, less on the story of you and your characters than the story of the world itself. So I think making Anachronox a PC-exclusive title was something of a hard sell in 2001. It's not that the game's JRPG focus is bad, just that JRPGs generally went against the design instincts of what people on this platform were expecting. If you want a modern comparison, think about how free-to-play energy mechanics are generally accepted on mobile games, but console and PC players would violently reject them. Sometimes platforms do just change our expectation of game design. This is less true now in a world with Fallout on consoles and Final Fantasy hitting PCs, but in 2001 it certainly felt true. There was a much more rigid divide between PC and console gaming. Similarly, the implementation of point-and-click mechanics was, let's say, awkwardly implemented and badly timed. We've seen a return to the genre in recent years, but 2001 was right around the time of a protracted decline for the point-and-click adventure genre. Not helping things was the design of the puzzles in Anachronox itself, which resulted in a lot of dead ends, bad pacing, which is a killer for a narrative-focused game, and frustrating puzzle solutions. Take Hephaestus, a planet that is part Mysterium Church, part theme park, and home to a cavalcade of aggressively 90s fonts. Your objective is to sneak into the church, and it becomes clear the solution is to stow away in a truck headed inside. You are told by the robot guarding the truck some facts about Mysterium, an invitation to read more about specific types of Mysterium at a specific bookstore, and a mention that the robot is expecting a delivery boy who is often late and probably sleeping around here somewhere. This gives you way too many vectors for potential solutions. Do we need to find this bookstore and buy the specific book we were told to look at? Or maybe it's not about the specific book, but finding more information about that particular mistech? Or maybe we need to find a delivery boy and do a quest for him. Oh, look, here's a sleeping guy, but I can't interact with him. Maybe it's something else. There was another guy sleeping back at the other store. Or maybe I just need to go to one of these vendors and buy some of the name-dropped mistech to understand it. Well, it turns out the answer is kind of none of that. You have to find the delivery slip next to the sleeping guy that has no indication that he's the delivery boy other than that he is sleeping, behind his briefcase, only visible when standing on the other side of the room from which you enter, which is unlikely because there is nothing else to do in that room and it dead ends. This underscores why no one tries point-and-click adventure games in true 3D. It's frustrating enough to pixel hunt from a fixed perspective, but when camera angles can obscure the doodad that moves the game mechanics forward, hunting for that single magical object can become maddening. Luckily, this is one of the more egregious examples of the problem, but the whole game is littered with one-off things like this. But if Anachronox's systems never really work to its advantage, its setting, world building, and above all its tone absolutely do.
Look, you left a sock over there. Over there. Is it so hard to pick up after yourself?
What? I was gonna pick it up tomorrow.
Tomorrow? Tomorrow? You son of a...
Should we stop them, man?
Let them kill each other.
Eat it! Eat it! Eat it! Eat it!
It's unabashedly a comedy game in a way not many games, and even not many comedy games, have been before or since, trying to strike a sense of humor somewhere between Douglas Adams, Monty Python, Jim Henson-era Muppets, and whimsical kids' books like Alice in Wonderland, The Phantom Tollbooth, or Wayside High. For example, I love the skit involving a prison ship with a, quote, emergency parole button. Really, I just love the idea of an emergency parole button.
Somebody hit the emergency parole button!
Is that good?
It's that Ron Gilbert / Tim Schafer school of game comedy that's funny, but not at all really edgy. There's basically no swearing, and they never go completely blue comedy, but they're not afraid to flirt with adult ideas either. Take, for example, the absurdist comedy of watching the unfathomably democratic Democritus reveal itself to be an oligarchy because voting on issues is hard and the everyday person might not get it. There's Sunder, a planet full of scientists that ironically acts more like a religion by sequestering heretics whose scientific views go against the orthodoxy at the Rainbow Sanctuary, and whose name is a cute reference to the fact that the planet gets split in two. Really, just about all the names in this game are puns or plays on words.
In the matter of the Holy Order of the Brotherhood versus Sylvester Buccelli, aka Sylvester Sly Boots.
And there's Hephaestus, a religious planet that operates more like a hyper-capitalist theme park / industrial mine where bishops hawk t-shirts.
Do I get a cool robe?
How about a cool t-shirt?
These are inherently funny scenarios for your characters to find themselves in, and each one is filled to the brim with dialogue of characters who have to live or work or just exist in these absurd settings. You expect some of these things, like the grumpy concession worker on Hephaestus who finds the act of selling artifacts to tourists sacrilegious, but who is begrudgingly forced to do so because capitalism anyways. Other things you might not expect. The edgiest the game really gets is in the Red Light District. Throughout the whole game, there are these little worker aliens scattered around the universe called the Bipedri, and when you finally get to the Red Light District, there is a Bipedri strip club that you can watch little Bipedri go in and out of. It's the grimiest and seediest the game really gets, and it is adorable. And the game is full of little touches like that. I love that you almost never see the bottom of Boots' shoe, but when you do, he has a little piece of gum on them because he's a detective. Gumshoe. I love that the final quest of the game is offered to you out in the open in the first 5 minutes, but you don't recognize it. I love how on just about every planet there's at least one character whose sad fate or glorious comeuppance has stuck with me. I love that Dopefish is back. The game isn't laugh out loud funny. It can't be. It's 30 to 40 hours long. So unlike stuff like Goat Simulator or Jazz Punk or other aggressively comedic games, it's not a short injection of absolute hilarity. But like a lot of the scum games that inspired its point-and-click parts, it's incessantly clever and never really pulls its tongue from its cheek. It's not a game where you cry from laughing and put away after 30 minutes, but it is a game you can play for hours with a continuous smile. We don't get enough comedy games in general these days, but we certainly don't get enough slow burn comedies, and that's refreshing to see. Helping sell the game's comedy and sense of personality are the cutscenes. Now these look really rough by today's mocap HD standards, and that's not really helped by the 16:9 resolution I recorded at, revealing all the stuff they popped in and out of existence for performance reasons, expecting 4:3 monitors to be the norm forever. But compare them to their competition. Final Fantasy was still doing pre-rendered cinematics that looked nothing like the in-game characters. Deus Ex has stuffy shot-reverse shot scenes with characters so stoic there's no reason for them to emote. Meanwhile, Daikatana's self-serious intro underscores the weaknesses of not having facial expressions and delivering everything via telling rather than showing. Cinematic cutscenes with real-time editing designed to deliver comedic timing and facial expressions in-engine, in real time, using actual game assets was not really a thing at the time outside of, Metal Gear Solid, and even then they weren't using the Quake 2 engine, which was never designed to do any of this to begin with. And because the game used the Quake 2 engine to perform its animated cutscenes, there's a charmingly early machinima affect to them. These days, the aesthetic is probably mostly known for stuff like Source Filmmaker videos created in Gary's Mod or whatever, but time was, all those lo-fi tricks were simply how in-game cutscenes were made. Like, a lot of little cheats are done to make up for custom animations they didn't have. Sliding models around in their default poses to fake movement, tilting the entire character model to make it look like they are leaning into talk, clever cinematography that reframes one animation as another given a different context, jump cuts to hide the transition from one model to the next. There's a simplicity to the problem solving that I suspect some may see as cheap, but I find gives the game a sort of quaint charm that reflects the time in which it was made.
Hi.
Hi?
Hi there.
Hi!
Yeah, this is gonna sound funny,
Peculiar, really.
but we heard
Through the grapevine.
that you had an unusual
Condition.
accident that left you
Unusual.
with one leg. And we were wondering if,
By any chance?
you might give us...
Loan us.
Loan us, yeah. Your, sock.
Sock.
Your sock.
Part of the reason I felt obligated to bring up Tom Hall's time at id is that Anachronox feels like Doom in a very specific way. Where Doom conveyed the personalities and interests of a creative team led by Carmack and Romero, Anachronox feels like it conveys the personalities and interests of a creative team led by Hall. It is all character, quirk, world building, and jokes. And I feel like you can trace a line from Keen straight through to Anachronox. And with the support of IDOS, Ion Storm was able to blow those abstract ideas up into a massive, sprawling adventure. Perhaps too massive. The game buckled under its own weight. The original design doc for the game was over 400 pages of story and characters and mechanics and world descriptions, and given the ridiculous scope combined with the production woes that plagued all of Ion Storm at the time, it was decided to chuck the back third to back half of the narrative to expansion packs or sequels that never came. The story is still unfinished. Anachronox effectively ends at a point in the JRPG where everything changes and you would be asked to take out the first disc and insert disc 2. And that's a shame because after 30 or so hours, the game was just starting to scratch beneath the surface of its characters. Anachronox means poison from the past, and while that's certainly true for the bigger plotline, it's also true of the adventurers themselves. Each of these characters gets setups for reconciling with their history, but none of it really gets resolved, none of it pays off. The game feels like it was on the cusp of going from funny to resonant, and then just ends. What you're left with is a fundamentally enjoyable, humorous game that teases a bigger universe, not just spatially, but emotionally, that will never come. I don't want to say that Anachronox is this perfect, overlooked gem or worth playing for the story and comedy even if the mechanics are janky, because I don't necessarily think either of those things are true. But I also think the game is a fascinating product of its time, a hybrid of two genres no one has ever really tried to put together before or since, and with a dry comedic style we don't get nearly enough of in this medium. And it is undeniably Ion Storm's most human game, embracing levity and at least hinting at pain and loss rather than stoic discussions of political theory or a desire to be the most badassiest thing on the planet. And for those reasons alone, I think it deserves better than to be the forgotten half-sibling of Deus Ex and Daikatana.
Very nice.